Hello, welcome to APARC and EAI's online seminar, South Korea's Strategy in Times of a Great Economic Decoupling. This is part of EAI's ongoing COVID-19 and New World Order seminar series. I'm Yul Sohn, President of EAI. I'm proud of jointly hosting with Stanford University's Walter Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center on such an important topic. Special thanks to its director, Kyuk Shin, who actually suggested the idea of having this event. As the U.S. China economic ties are in danger, regional states are forced to adjust to a great economic decoupling. Nothing presented more challenge to the established status of South Korea as an advanced trading state than the rise of decoupling, because its economy is highly intertwined with both Chinese and American economies, and it is also a significant foreign policy challenge. So I'm excited with two panels prepared today, one on politics and the other business and economics. On the political panel, we are honored and pleased to have Professor David Kang of University of Southern California, Seungjoo Lee from Chung-Ang University, and Sung-Ho Shin from Seoul National University. On the business panel, we are proud of featuring Mr. Charles Freeman of U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Taeho Park of Lee & Co. Global Commerce Institute. He is the former trade minister of ROK, and Yong-Suk Lee from APARC Stanford. Prior to formally commencing the seminar, I would like to hand my mic over to Director Kyuk Shin, who is the director, and William Perry, Professor of Contemporary Korea at Stanford University.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sohn. Good morning in Korea and good evening on the East Coast. So I'm really happy to co-host today's event with the East Asian Institute. Yeah, we all know that we are living the time of great challenges. Here in the States, we have been in shelter-in-place for over 6 months. And it's likely to continue this way for quite some time. Here at Stanford, as in many other places, we are conducting all our meetings, including classes, online. Actually, I haven't been to my office, actually less than 1 mile from my house since March. Despite all these difficult challenges, the silver lining is that this kind of webinar can bring people from all over the world into one place simultaneously. It's wonderful to see many friends and colleagues from Korea, US, and elsewhere. It's a especially challenging time for South Korea as well. I mean, we can name many different things like pandemic, economic difficulties, political polarization, North Korean issues, relations with China, and so on. But among them, one of the most challenging that Korea is facing today is the ongoing political and economic tensions between the US and China. The US is Korea's military ally, but China is Korea's top trading partner. Korea's strategy between two big powers has been to cooperate with the United States for security and China for economy, or in Korea what they call 안미 경중. But this paradigm may not work anymore because business also tied to security issues under the current political climate. So many other Asian countries, Korea is trying to avoid a situation where it's forced to choose either the US or China. but it may be inevitable if the current situation continues. So if the U.S. China decoupling occurs, for example, what choice is Korea left with other than having to choose one or the other? So today in this joint seminar, we will be addressing this grave dilemma that Korea is facing today. And as Dr. Sohn mentions, we have two panels, one on security, the other business. And I'm very honored and pleased to have an excellent group of scholars in front of you from both Korea and the United States. So I very much look forward to a wonderful discussion today. And then thanks for joining us today. So now I'll turn back to Dr. Sohn for the first session. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's get it started. The first session, like I said before, we featured three prominent scholars, two speakers and one discussant. For our first speaker, David Kang, is a Maria Crutcher Professor in International Relations, Business, and East Asian Language and Culture at the University of Southern California, with appointment in both School of International Relations and Marshall School of Business. He's also the director of U.S Korean Studies Institute, and he has written extensively on Asia's international relations and also South Korean policies. So welcome. And Seungjoo Lee, our second speaker, is professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Chung-Ang University. He's the chair of the Trade Technology Transformation Research Center here at EAI. And he is a leading scholar in the field of international political economy in Korea. His research focused on East Asian regionalism, middle power diplomacy, and economic security nexus. And later, our discussant is Sung-ho Shin, who is a professor of international security and East Asia and the former dean for Office of International Affairs, at the Seoul National University. He served as visiting fellow at the East-West Center and Synapse fellow at Brookings Institution, and he advises various government organizations of ROK. So with that said, we will go on this way. Each speaker will spend about 7 to 9 minutes. And then our discussant Sung-ho, we will spend about 5 to 6 minutes. And after then, we will have some, free discussions for the remainder of the time. And I will give some of the questions that I think is important, and I think both presenters will reflect on those questions. East Asia, we have just said that is facing the danger of economic decoupling as the U.S. China economic ties are strained. States like South Korea are forced to reorient their, for example, supply chains and also commercial relationship with China. Then the couple of questions. One is will we likely see how far the decoupling goes? That's the critical question. That will we really see economic decoupling and economic blocks we saw during the Cold War or during the 1930s. So prediction, that's one question. And two, in pursuit of decoupling, will the United States be able to exercise the leadership that leverages values, norms, and interests that other states like South Korea, in this case, actually share? One good case is, economic partnership network type of thing. And finally, what are the geopolitical consequences for the Korean Peninsula and South Korea in particular? So with those questions, I will, pass the mic to David Kang.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, both from Seoul EAI. I've long enjoyed my relationship with you, and obviously with Stanford's APARC and Director Sheen. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us. And I'll try and be relatively brief. And I'm going to make two observations and then 2 points. I've been on a lot of these panels in the last year, couple of years, 6 months. And, 2 observations that I find myself making a lot. Number one, when we think about how Korea will operate between U.S. and China, it's really important to remember that Korea shares some, but not all, American priorities. And that's okay. Whenever I'm talking to an American audience, I try and emphasize this. It's not realistic to expect Korea will totally always take the U.S. side. We see that already with issues of TPP, clearly with strategies towards North Korea. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't. There are a number of ways in which Korea has its own national interests. And so the task for the U.S. and Korea, for the alliance, is to accept that those are differences and to work them out. I mean, it's okay to disagree over SMA and how much money. They may or may not be able to work it out, but the idea that Korea will always share U.S. interests, I think, is not realistic. And the second point builds off the first, second observation builds off the first, which is no matter what, Korea is not moving away. There's nothing you can do, right? Korea is where Korea is. It's got a land border with China. It's 50 miles, 70 kilometers from Japan. That's where it is. And so no matter what, for better or for worse, Korea is stuck managing relations with China. I mean, again, it's unrealistic to expect that a Korea or almost any Asian country is going to engage in pure containment of China and to unequivocally join the United States. Some may think that Japan will. I'm not even sure that if we actually see how Japan is behaving, whether it will completely decouple from China. But certainly I don't think a Korea or a Vietnam or a Philippines can realistically even consider that. The task is not to solve the problem. The task is how we manage relations with a massive neighbor and manage relations with one of the most important countries that Korea has a friendship with, a relationship with, which is the United States. So it's not moving away. And within that, I'll make 2 points. The first one is about Korea, which is often when we think about how Korea is going to manage its political relationships, it's easy to get into the win-lose binary choices. But in many ways, what Korea has been trying to do, as Professor Shin said, has been to avoid having to make that choice. And it's easy for us to say, well, they're going to have to choose. But the task for adroit Korean politicians in diplomacy is to find ways in which some of those interests are met and others aren't. I mean, that's what diplomacy is about. And as I said, it's unrealistic to think that a Korea would totally bandwagon with China and cut the U.S. off. I mean, all this talk of kicking the U.S. troops out or pulling the U.S. troops out is fairly extreme. On the other hand, the idea that a Korea would only have relations with the United States and not with China is also unrealistic. So the task is, how are they going to balance these? Especially when the overwhelming security concern for Korea is North Korea. It's not really Chinese invasion. It's North Korean security issues, where Korea does need both China and the United States. It's hard to imagine any resolution to the issues on the peninsula that don't have both U.S. and Chinese, at least, approval, if not support. So it's not easy. But I said this just last week at the Korea Society. Koreans have a very long history of learning how to push back on China. many centuries of knowing how to argue over borders and often win a debate with a big, massive China. And that's the task for today. And it's the task for managing relationship with the United States. Because one of the interesting things about the way that when we watch international politics work, it's easy to view that most politics is like a bully taking lunch money from a smaller country, right? Give me your dough. But a lot of times, larger countries don't exploit smaller countries as much as we think. And the task for South Korea is to remember how it can manage those relations, to focus on the key security concern, which is actually North Korea. So that's one point. My second point goes to the U.S. One of the largest questions is, can the U.S. continue to use leadership or be a leader in the region? I would actually say, to me, that is a much larger question. I'm not actually concerned that much about a titanic battle between two countries, whether it's Cold War, containment, or whatever else between U.S. and China. I know that much of us think that way. In fact, most of the power transition literature, the Thucydides trap, all of that is about two dominant, declining power and a rising power, and inevitably they clash. That's what everyone's worried about. If we look at the rise and decline of Asian dynasties, the Ming, the Qing, almost every Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese dynasty, whether it's Shilla or Goryeo, they didn't fall. The Mongol hordes coming over the border are the exception. Overwhelmingly, these dynasties fell from within. It was the internal issues that caused them to crumble. And if we want to use the lessons of Asian history, I think they are loudly and clearly saying, yeah, maybe there's a threat from China, but the internal problems that we face, both in China, but I care about the United States, are the ones we need to focus on. I don't even need to enumerate. When we talk about the COVID response, I think that's a classic example, right? The United States may be in the process of taking ourselves out of any great game. If we don't get our economic, social, racial, political act together, we may no longer be a factor in a couple decades. So to me, the internal challenges are more than the external challenges. And when we think about how that's going to happen with U.S.-China relations, I think that in many ways, the possibility for the U.S. to remain a leader depends much more on the decisions we make and the internal challenges we face than any external challenge from China. If we can manage them, I think we will continue to have great leadership in East Asia. If we don't manage our internal issues, I think it won't really matter what we think, because the region is going to move along on itself. So I will stop there. Thank you so much, and I hope I was thought-provoking.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Two great points. One is to sort of precarious but delicate balance between security ties with the United States and economic engagement with China, and that's the art of diplomacy for South Korea, and that always can work throughout the history. And two is some politician says that foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy starts from domestic front, right? Economic policies. So we'll see internal problems, whether how that works to the U.S. leadership. And let's move to Seungjoo, please.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Sohn. I'm very pleased to join today's panel, which is very timely. I'll try to answer guiding questions on the first and second questions about the possibility of decoupling and the emergence of the competing trade blocs in East Asia. I would say there are some mixed signs about it because there are facilitating factors as well as countervailing forces in the process of changes in supply chains. If we look at the changes in geopolitical dynamics in East Asia, actually I would say that geopolitical dynamics is clearly at work in the decoupling process of supply chain. as the U.S. China strategic competition has intensified for the last couple of years, as vividly demonstrated in the U.S. restriction against Huawei. I think recently, particularly after the January of this year, U.S. government approach to decoupling has become more systematic, as the U.S. government has paid more attention to cooperation with allies and partners, departing away from unilateral actions of last year. I think in this sense, the tech competition between the US and China moved into the second stage, or tech competition 2.0. I think such kind of tech competition is likely to bring about profound changes that will facilitate the decoupling of supply chains in East Asia. That is one of my first points. And on the second point, at the same time, I think we should keep in mind that the tech competition is not the only source of changes in supply chains in East Asia, because structural changes have proceeded since the early 2000s in East Asia. Particularly, supply chains in East Asia have gone regional. I think it has to do with China's industrial upgrading and the strengthening endogenous capabilities. So here, the point I would like to make is that the decoupling has proceeded even before U.S.-China strategic competition. And another point I would like to take up is that the geopolitical or geo-economic consequence of the rise of China. Actually, for the last couple of decades, actually the economic rise of China was both opportunities as well as risks for many of East Asian countries. And nowadays, some East Asian countries began to worry about over-dependence on China. And I think natural rebalancing will likely to continue to reduce their economic exposure to China. I think those are the kind of the facilitating factors that push further the decoupling of supply chains in East Asia. And moving on to the countervailing forces, I think in terms of feasibility, the complete decoupling may not be possible. Actually, back in the January of this year, when the first phase deal was completed between the United States and China, and the USTR Lighthizer was quoted as saying that decoupling is neither desirable nor possible. Actually, in that sense, the decoupling may not be the correct word. Rather, partial disengagement would be the reality we will face in the coming years. And another point I would like to make is that the regionalization of supply chains will further proceed, thereby strengthening the hierarchical nature of supply chains in East Asia. Its implication is that China will consolidate its top position within the supply chains as it continuously cultivates endogenous capabilities as well as upgrades its industrial structure in the coming years. And the one last point on this question I would like to make is that the reconfiguration of supply chains is indeed industry-specific as well as case-specific. From the standpoint of corporate strategy, I think this issue will be picked up again in the second session. But I think from the standpoint of the corporate strategy, decoupling of supply chains is a part of the corporate global strategy. And the dynamics of decoupling is quite different from industry to industry. For instance, for the last two decades, Korea has emerged as the #1 investor in Vietnam by investing in over $60 billion. And in the case of Samsung, actually Samsung's FDI in Vietnam largely concentrated in such areas as smartphones and flat panel display. By contrast, for the last 3 years, actually Samsung has increased its investment in China, particularly in the areas of semiconductor manufacturing. So the point I would like to make again is that reconfiguration of supply chain is a kind of industry specific, even case specific. So in that sense, we can have kind of the mixed signals about the possibility of decoupling as well as the emergence of the competing economic blocks in East Asia. Moving on to the next question about the possibility of the U.S. leadership in the process of decoupling. I think I do not rule out the possibility of U.S. leadership in redesigning the regional economic order in East Asia, although U.S. government has a lot of homework ahead. I think I would like to point out that the Economic Prosperity Network shows some signs of changes in the sense that U.S. government began to provide alternatives for allies and partners, again departing away from unilaterally demanding East Asian countries to join its efforts to contain China. So when proposing the idea of the Economic Prosperity Network, the U.S. government described it not just as a coalition of convenience, but as trust-based partnership. Particularly, Undersecretary Keith Clark stressed that the EPN will be comprised of like-minded countries, companies, institutions, and civil society that operate under the set of trust principles. In that regard, I think the U.S. policy proposal of the EPN shows some possibility of the U.S. leadership in the coming years in reorganizing the regional order in East Asia. But at the same time, the creation of the EPN would be a long-term process. It's not a matter of one day or two, actually. So many countries in the region will face the problem of current losses versus future gains. Actually, the cost and burden of decoupling and the cooperation with the United States takes place now, but it will take some time for East Asian countries to realize gains by joining the EPN. So one thing U.S. government should take care of is that how to relieve East Asian countries' concerns and woes about the problems associated with the current losses and future gains. And the last two remaining questions, I will try to be brief as much as possible. The geopolitical consequences for the Korean Peninsula and what should Korea do? Actually, in the short run, the geopolitical consequence would be the weaponized interdependence in the region. And I would say the weaponization of interdependence would be the dominant feature emerging in East Asia, as vividly demonstrated in the U.S.-China trade war. So I think we cannot rule out the possibility that Korea may become a victim of weaponization of interdependence in the coming years. Particularly, Korea may be squeezed between the US and China and have to run the risk of making a strategic decision. And then what should South Korea do? Let me just take up 2 points. First, in the short term, Korea needs to skillfully but carefully take advantage of the US offensive against China. As in the case of the 5G competition, Korea should be able to establish its position as a Huawei's alternative. The US government already specified Samsung together with Ericsson and Nokia as an alternative partner to Huawei, and Korea should be able to fully take advantage of such a policy shift. And the second, US-China tech competition will involve a restructuring of supply chains in the region, and Korea is not an exception to this trend. But under the circumstance, Korea should seek so-called China plus Alpha strategy in restructuring the supply chains in the region. Korea should try to diversify supply chains while maintaining the existing supply chains in China. In the face of pressures both from the US and China, Korea should approach the restructuring or reconfiguration of the supply chain in the broad context of strengthening and diversifying supply chains. So here, crucial is that Korea should be very careful and sophisticated so that such an attempt should not be read as exit China or contain China. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Seungjoo. Excellent presentation. The decoupling, he nicely delineated kind of history and dimensions of decoupling in technology side and structural change, and sort of East Asia's overdependence on China for the past decade, and also he proposed the idea of how to counterbalance these trends, and particularly South Korea's position vis-a-vis, let's say, U.S. proposals of APN and others. So with that, let me move to Seungho for your comments. So your comments will also include some questions to the presenters, right?
Yes,
Yes,
possibly.
then yeah, I'll leave time for that.
Thank you so much. Two great presentation and perspective. First of all, Professor Kang, David, all those two observations and 2 points, I couldn't agree more with you. saying that Korea is stuck geographically in between China and Japan. We cannot move away from China border. And also history, we have a long history. It goes back all the way like at least 2,000 years. Those factors fact much about. As a result, Korea is in difficult position, and under the pressure, we don't want to make a binary choice, definitely. So in that regard, my observation regarding Korea's response to this U.S. decoupling, if there is any such a serious effort, has been, let me say, give you two kind of points. One is that in terms of security interest, I think if I may use the word of decoupling, which is the key word for this seminar, I think Korea has tried to kind of decouple U.S. ROK alliance from the U.S. China competition strategically. So there should be no confusion. It's not like Korea decoupled from the U.S. We try to decouple U.S. ROK alliance from the U.S. China competition. That's just my observation. That is that the current government and previous government, we still understand that ROK-US alliance is the pillar of Korea's national security policy. And that will be the case, I think, for a coming decade, if not a century. So that means even if there is an end of a Korean War or peace treaty between two Koreas or US North Korea, the President Moon Jae-in said clearly, even after unification, during his meeting with General Abrams, the U.S. commander in Korea, said that even after unification, we want to keep our alliance with the United States. So, and I think that is at this moment, at least I can say, widely shared by the Korean public, whether you're conservative or liberal, So, but the problem is by keeping this U.S. alliance, ROK alliance, as U.S. China competition goes up, we are under heavy pressure to go into that. But we try to, I think, avoid, in that sense, decouple from that pressure. For example, like Indo-Pacific strategy, not to say we are not interested, we don't want to join, but at least we are trying to avoid that kind of competition. And we are getting sucked into this South China Sea issue or East China Sea issue. We want to keep our alliance as a kind of still defending South Korea from the possible attack by North Korea or any other contingency on the Korean Peninsula. My second point is in that effort by Korea to keep or strengthen the alliance, even with the restructuring going on from with wartime operational control, transfer, and all that. Problem is, I think, the U.S. leadership here. We all know that what is Mr. Trump's position, and he's demanding 5 times increase in our SMA burden sharing. Otherwise, he threatens to pull out U.S. troops from Korea as he did with Germany. So I think that the danger of to the U.S. The long-term future of ROK-U.S. alliance, one could say, there are some issues from Korea's side, but also it is also coming from the U.S. side as well, which is related to, I think, what David mentioned about U.S. domestic issue, domestic politics, and U.S. leadership. That's just my very short observation on the David's discussion and point. My final point regarding Professor Lee's economic dimension, trade and all that. I'm not an expert on the economic issue, so this is from very layman's perspective. I think there is still kind of maybe one issue is, yes, when I'm reading all those newspapers, South Korea is under pressure because companies are forced to cut their ties with Huawei, for example, and which Samsung and LG and South Korea's major company has a huge stake in Chinese market and Chinese business. But at the same time, I would like to ask, what about the American companies? It's not Chinese, Korean company who has a huge stake in China market and business, but we all know Apple and Tesla and all these American high-tech company has a huge interest and stake in China market. So when US try to decouple its own economy, first my question is it really possible? I mean, in that sense, I think this US-China competition is a little different from a Cold War US-Soviet Union competition. My second question or comment is that in that sense, I think in a way there's a kind of decoupling between US economy and Korean or Chinese economy, especially in this COVID situation. Case in point is that while all the other prediction for the economic growth for the next this year and next year is like a catastrophe, like a -7%, -9%, -6% for OECD or all those major economies, but only Korea has like a -1%, and China will have a plus still 2%. I think that in and itself is a kind of remarkable success or benefit from the South Korea and China's handling of this pandemic situation. That in and itself, I think, translate into somehow kind of economic decoupling, at least in terms of economic growth and situation. And the third is that in that regard, I guess Korean and Chinese economy. One example is that recently Korean stock market has lots of people saying it has been decoupled from American market. So I think that's a kind of very interesting to watch what will happen in the coming next year or decade. How, again, going back to maybe David's point of it's more about how US manage its own domestic situation, not only politics, but also COVID and its own economy. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Seungjoo. Let me. We already got lots of questions from the audience, and I thought that this question is relevant to Seungjoo's presentation, and so do you see the questions? And then after let me do this way. We have about 5 minutes to go. So Seungjoo, you go first to respond to Seunghoo's comments and also this question, and then move to David for your thoughts on the discussion question. So, Seungjoo, you go first.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Shin, for your comments and questions. Basically, I agree to your observations, particularly when you say that complete decoupling is not possible. I agree, particularly in the long run, the complete decoupling between the U.S. and China would not be possible because both economies are highly interdependent. But one point I would like to make is that uncertainty has steadily increased between the two countries. And in that regard, like the heightened uncertainty is not a good business environment for companies in both countries. For example, actually, as you said earlier, many U.S. companies has a huge stake in business in China. The U.S. government basically issued a temporary license in order to deal with the U.S. companies' interest in dealing with China. So that is one of the sources of uncertainties. And also, in the case of the semiconductors and 5G competition, actually, Huawei tried to increase its inventories as much as possible for the last 1 year or two. And then it is expected, according to the newspaper report, it is expected that Huawei will run out of inventory by the early of next year. So in that kind of uncertainty, because of that kind of uncertainty, actually many of the Western governments actually lost trust in Huawei's capability of installing 5G equipment in their countries. That's one of the reasons why some countries in Europe, such as UK and Germany and some other countries, tried to switch from Huawei from other 5G equipment providers. So uncertainty is, I think, clearly kicks in the U.S.-China strategy competition. So it's a kind of the battle of time. And another point you made is that the decoupling issue between Korean economy and U.S. economy or stock market in both countries. Actually, yeah, you're right. But I think actually Korea has a very complex relations with China because, like, in terms of the again the electronics industry. Actually, for example, Samsung and Huawei are both competitors as well as business partners. So there are, of course, negative consequences or influence as well as positive influence. That's one of the reasons why there are some signs of decoupling between the Korean economy and U.S. economy.
Thank you. Now, David, one argument from Seungjoo, decoupling alliance from the U.S.-China rivalry, will that work?
Yeah, no, I actually thought that was a really good point. And I was only going to just sort of double that or emphasize that. And I think what Korea is trying to do is say, and one of the things that always happens in the United States is we think that unless the Koreans are blatantly in favor of the alliance, then they're all opposed to it. I mean, it's so binary. But the fact is, Koreans from left and right value the deep American relationship, and the alliance is a central part of that. So trying to keep that separate from the actual U.S.-China issue, I think, is a major task for any South Korean president from either side, right? Whether they can do that, because the number of issues that the U.S. and Korea agree on the peninsula are many. We may disagree on how to do it, but keeping that separate from the U.S.-China issue, I think, is a great point, and one that I think Koreans are going to have to focus on. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think we will close this session. The one point that I would like to make while I listening to Seungjoo's question, presentation, decoupling is not just adjustment or reconfiguration of global supply chains, but it will create much more sort of make countries mercantilist, right? Zero-sum contest in the field of economics. And China might be less concerned with the liberal norms that we have established. So I think that point might be discussed in the next session. So I will pass it to Kyuk for the session 2.
Okay, thank you so much for very stimulating presentation and discussion. So we also have excellent panelists for this session. And let me briefly introduce their bio. First, Charles Freeman. He is a Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He really had a distinguished career in government, business, law, and academia. For example, he was Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China Affairs. He was Legislative Counsel in the U.S. Senate. He worked for Pepsi Corporation. He was Chair of China Studies at CSIS, and so on. So I'm very happy to have him, and also thanks for joining us from DC, which is about now approaching 9 p.m. The second panelist, Professor Taeho, who I've known for a long time, going back to his years as a Dean of GSIS as our national, and he spent some time at our center teaching a course on Korea. And he was also Minister for Trade of Korea, 2011 to 2013. He was Chairman of the Korea International Trade Commission. He worked at KDI, KF, and so on. And now he's president of think tank for Lee and Co. Law firm in Korea. And thank you so much for joining us, and great to see you again. And then finally, our own Yong-Suk Lee, who is a SK fellow. He's an economist and also working as deputy director for our Korea program. So I think given time, I'm going to ask our panelists to make a brief opening remarks, and then we can engage some conversation, maybe even some debate. So Charles, you go first.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here this evening and this morning. I started this morning with a conversation with current Trade Minister Yu from the ROK, and I finished it with on a panel with Foreign Minister Park. So that's very it's a good bookend to my day. But I want to pick up on something that Seungjoo said, which is business hates uncertainty, and that's absolutely correct. In the case of the United States business community, we look at China and we support a very robust commercial relationship with China, but we're unsure at how far our government, the U.S. government, will allow us to go in having that relationship. And the origins of U.S.-China trade tensions, they go back a long way. People tend to think that this is all an invention of President Trump. In fact, there has been this building of tension for a long period of time. When the United States and other WTO members negotiated to have China join the WTO in 2001, the assumption there was that China's economy and the people and the Communist Party would continue to decouple as they had for some period of time before 2001, and that market economics would largely form the basic nature of the Chinese economy. Well, that didn't happen, and I think the United States government increasingly became frustrated with China's exercise of comprehensive national power, which included a heavy dose of statecraft, and the perception that Chinese economic plans included domination of 5G, domination in AI, domination in a variety of new technologies globally, has stimulated the current administration to adopt its own form of comprehensive national power and the use of economic statecraft. And that's really at the heart of the U.S. China conflict. And we'll just narrow it down. Huawei has been mentioned a number of times. Yes, the Samsung and SK Hynix and other Korean companies have very strong relations with Huawei. Well, so do American companies. So have American companies. It has been a very good customer and partner for a lot of American tech firms. And I had a conversation last night with a senior U.S. official in the White House, and we said, "So how far is how far can we go? What's the line? What's the red line of commercial interaction with Huawei, for example?" And he said very clearly, "Listen, we pulled out a gun, pointed it at Huawei's head, and we've pulled the trigger." So the answer seems to be that at least on the U.S. side, there will be an absolute prohibition of any commercial relationship with Huawei for the long term. And when you raise the concern about uncertainty, the response is, well, the uncertainty is generated. The response from the U.S. government is uncertainty is generated by the Chinese policy, which effectively forces the U.S. to act in a way which may decouple the United States and its partners from China, really as a matter of global economic and global strategy. So that leaves the Korean economy in a difficult position. Yes, no one is trying to force a choice between the United States and China, but on certain areas, in higher tech areas, that choice is pretty clear. Samsung and SK Hynix have, like American companies, have applied to the U.S. Department of Commerce for an exemption to allow them to continue to sell to Huawei. I don't see that being approved, and so the question will be exactly what does Samsung and SK Hynix do with Samsung Electronics, if you assume that they're about 3% of their overall customer base is Huawei. I think SK Hynix may be closer to 7%. That's a significant loss. And so the question is, how can they make that up? I think Seungjoo rightly said there are opportunities, to be a competitor or an alternative to Huawei in 5G, particularly in the United States, which lags far behind and doesn't have our own indigenous 5G capability. So there are some opportunities there. But, longer term, this is going to be a significant challenge because I'm not sure that Huawei is the end in terms of U.S. policy with respect to China and efforts to effectively pull out the gun and pull the trigger at certain Chinese industries. Does that mean decoupling? Yeah, I think decoupling in certain industries is inevitable, and the United States will use both its economic power and its as a market, its draw as a market, and its coercive power to try to force partners like Korea to effectively decouple in those industries. And let me just close by saying, there may be a point at which the United States effectively says to its partners, you can sell soybeans, soda pop, and soap, but not anything more significant. And whether the ENP or other formulations are effective, I would just suggest that the United States has to also stop, if they want to be effective in creating these kinds of networks, they have to stop using security as a tool in bilateral trade relations allies and friends like Korea, and they also have to stop focusing on meaningless trade statistics like the bilateral trade deficit. So if they can get over those hurdles and genuinely focus on creating an EPN that makes both commercial and strategic sense, there's a good chance that it will succeed. But you know, the long-term prospects for commerce with China are really in doubt.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to Professor Park.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Shin. Good to see you. Not in person, but at least from the screen. And I think Mr. Professor Lee's remarks is very excellent. Actually, he should have come to the second session because he covered most of the economic issues regarding the decoupling. And also, Charles mentioned that he met with our minister, Myung-hee Yu, this morning or this afternoon in Washington. I think she is running for campaigning for her race for the position of Director General of the WTO. I think today, Geneva time, they'll make announcement of the first round result, which they will select 5 people. I hope Minister Yu is one of them. Well, anyway, I prepare a short opening remarks, which may take 5 minutes. I will just present my remarks. As a background in my presentation, I would like to begin with a few observations on the recent behaviors of the multinational firms, which pay more attention to economic security than economic efficiency in the global business activities. For example, some firms operating in foreign countries could consider moving their production facilities to other regions, including their home countries, which we call reshoring. And some other firms are redesigning their global value chain by diversifying or shortening the value chain. I would also like to say a few words on the industrial decoupling. Many people already mentioned this. Industrial decoupling, as far as I understand, may be a phenomena which could be resulted from multinational firms' responses to non-economic risk. However, we cannot simply analyze or systematically predict the firm's behaviors because individual firms' business activities or objectives are all different. I don't want to repeat this. This is a very general remark. With this as an introduction, I would like to briefly discuss about the Korean companies' experiences so far. Let me start with the impact of the U.S. China trade disputes on the Korean firms' trade performance. According to the Korea International Trade Association, Korea's total exports decreased by 10.4% in 2019. But it's interesting to note that Korea's export to China decreased by 16%, while its exports to the United States actually increased by 0.9% in 2019. We need more precise analysis, but at least I can say that the Korean firms that export to China hurt seriously, much more than the average, while some Korean firms may have benefited as the U.S. replaces some of these imports from China with the goods imported from Korea. Second, let me look at the impact of the U.S. sanctions against Huawei. Also, this is the issue many people already discussed. As the U.S. asked major countries to ban their mobile providers from buying Huawei 5G equipment, some Korean mobile providers are also reluctant to continue to purchase Huawei 5G equipment. In the meantime, it was reported in the newspaper that Samsung Electronics recently won a more than $6 billion project to provide wireless communication solutions to Verizon in the United States, which is a major gain in the next generation 5G network market. In a way, Samsung Electronics benefited from the U.S. sanctions against Huawei. However, Korean semiconductor firms, as many people noted, are facing serious difficulties as the U.S. banned the supply of semiconductors made with the U.S. equipment, software, and design to Huawei without prior approval from the United States. Third, I would like to introduce a few interesting cases regarding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on specific Korean firms. Actually, major Korean automaker was unable to produce automobiles since some parts of components to be produced in China are not delivered due to the closure of the factory in China right after the surge of the COVID-19 pandemic in China early this year. I understand there are a few other industrial firms in Korea which had similar difficulties. First, let me say a few words on the Korea's trade with China. First, about 80% of Korea's export to China are parts and components, not the final goods. It is well known that a number of the firms, Korean firms, large and small, export intermediate goods to their subsidiaries in China. And then these subsidiary firms produce final goods by assembling parts and components imported from Korea and export most of the final product to the rest of the world, especially to the U.S. market. Second, Korea's imports of intermediate goods from China are not much, in other words, relatively smaller than our export to China. Based on these characteristics of Korea's trade with China, the impact of the U.S.-China trade disputes and COVID-19 pandemic on Korean firms' global supply chain could be relatively small compared to other parts of the world. Now, I would like to end my presentation. As far as Korean firms are concerned, there will not be large-scale industrial decoupling, of course, except some specific industries, at least in the near future. Of course, some Korean firms in China that used to produce goods and export them to the U.S. may consider moving their operations to other regions or even investing in the U.S. Korean automakers will try to secure additional supply sources of their parts and components outside China. Also, Korea's semiconductor firms will seek for new export markets outside China and face deeper competition, particularly in the U.S. market. However, other Korean firms may expand their operations in China or try to export more to China from abroad, as the government of China shifts its policy emphasis from exports to domestic consumption and investment. In sum, so far, Korean firms are not too much concerned with the industrial decoupling between the U.S. and China. However, as many people noted, if the U.S. puts more pressure on Korean firms to cut their business relations with China, they will face huge difficulties because their business volumes with China are simply too large. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Young-Suk, you want to make a brief response to both presentations?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both Dr. Freeman and Professor Bach. So I just wanted to make an observation, or it could be more of a devil's advocate. But the idea that, yes, I think this was mentioned, that tension between China and the U.S. in terms of trade, or as a matter of fact, South Korea or the U.S. or Japan or the U.S. It's been going on for a long periods of time. And a lot of this is surrounded by either imbalance, trade imbalance, one country exporting more, offshoring, where U.S. manufacturing is going to Asia, intellectual property rights, etc. And these things are related, are sensitive, politically important for the domestic U.S. population because it's related to jobs. When these type of things happen, it affects jobs. And that's why it's been a political issue, important issue for many decades. The whole bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., the initial initiative by Trump administration, these are nothing new. Well, what's new, I think, in the recent round of trade tension or U.S. China decoupling, economic decoupling, is about technology. And the argument is that, because China has, the Chinese government, the state has control over many of their tech companies, personal information of U.S. residents can go to China and could be used at their own whim. And that's sort of the main argument behind this whole tension. And it seemed like the Huawei 5G, recently TikTok, WeChat, and it's been exploding. But I think today, or in very recent days, we might actually see a shift in this whole paradigm. It could be a tipping point. I'm not sure. It's just speculation. But as you may know, TikTok, it's been agreed that I believe Oracle and Walmart will take the majority share of TikTok's operation in the US. Now, it still needs approval by the Trump administration and by Beijing. But suppose this actually goes and happens. This is it could be an ingenious effort by the Trump administration to resolve this technical dispute. It's an old playbook that's played by Japan, South Korea a long time ago when there's companies trying to come in. They said, no, you can't come in, but if we create a joint venture, yes, we'll do that. We'll trade technology, we'll share information. Suppose this actually goes through. TikTok actually becomes a joint venture between the US and China. That's a major step. And then you think about what's happening about WeChat. There's not many days left, and there's probably going to be additional talks about WeChat. So if the narrative is that, okay, there's just been this trade tension where it's been blowing up, but suddenly there's this conclusion where there's a joint venture between the US and China. I think this shifts the momentum and the story of what we are seeing right now quite a bit. It could be a new era of integration between China and the US. So decoupling could already be an old statement. Now, this is very speculative, but suppose that's happened. So the idea is that, if there is trade tension between two countries, South Korea could potentially benefit because there's a trade diversion, etc. But if there is this major integration between the two largest economies of the world in certain innovative tech sectors, what does that imply for South Korea? If they continue to be manufacturers of goods to these companies, providing part of the supply chain, I think that puts them into a more precarious position. So for South Korea to actually think beyond where they are, they need to think about this model. So economic nationalism has been rising, and it's not just the US, many countries around the world. And the surprising way that the Trump administration has shown to solve this is by this very novel approach of a joint venture. If this is a new pattern that we can foresee, what should South Korean companies' strategies be? I think that's the question I want to pose and the different angle that you might want to examine going forward. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Professor Shin.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to add one more point to Yul Sohn's comment, and then maybe two of you can respond. By the way, for the audience, please send your questions. We will collect and then have some time to address your questions. So regarding this decoupling, I mean, this is a very complex, issue. For maybe discussions, let's assume that maybe the opposite to what Yul Sohn was saying. Let's say, totally two different, platform in a high tech. For example, US establishing one platform of 5G or whatever, and China has its own. Okay, so I think for example, I don't know if it's the right example, but for smartphone, we have two different operating systems, right? In Apple and Android. They're totally different, but still fine. I mean, in a sense, they're competing. And then, Koreans are, using Apple, but also Samsung based on Android. So obviously, transitional period can be quite painful. But let's assume that total decoupling is certain high-tech area, and US has its own platform, and China has the other one. And would it be really bad for a place like Korea, or it might be good actually? I mean, once again, a transitional period can be quite painful, but in the end, what's going to happen? So, once again, that's a totally different scenario. And then maybe for discussion, I'd like to ask to panelists or presenters to respond to this and Yul Sohn's comments altogether.
Well, maybe I'll start and then ask Mr. Bach to step in. Yul Sohn, I like your formulation. It's good to have an optimist. That those of us that live in DC could use some optimism. I think, unfortunately, that the example of TikTok and maybe WeChat, we'll see, is probably the exception rather than the rule. And I think the administration, either the Trump administration or a Biden administration, will continue to focus on making sure that that China's efforts to direct, both civil military fusion and to expand data network or the control of data networks beyond China's borders, which I think this administration, our administration certainly believes is what the goal of China is. If that continues, then I don't think that there will be as optimistic of an outcome. As for a bifurcated supply chain, I agree with you, Professor Shin, that it's not necessarily a bad thing for Korea to be able to sell and market to two separate supply chains. If anybody can do it effectively, it's Korea. And so the only question will be the extent to which the United States and China and potentially others that are involved on either side insist that certain technologies not be shared with the other side. And so I can see it for a bifurcation of the supply chain for things like handsets and kind of lower level tech. I certainly see the potential that will continue. As your semiconductors advance, I think there'll be increasing pressure not to share that with either side. So there's certainly opportunities for Korea as a result of bifurcation. I think bottom line, it's bad for business. And the bifurcation of supply, of hardware supply, the bifurcation of internet and data services, these are all a bad thing, not just for business, but for global commerce, and I would argue for the long-term health and sustainability of the global economy.
Okay, I want to address to the question raised by Dr. Shin. Hypothetically, if this happens, maybe Korea will be in a good position to serve both markets. But as long as China or United States don't give any penalties to Korean firms who are doing this, then we are free to do this. But I don't think we can be very free in using both markets, even though this is formed. In other words, some kind of economic prosperity network, or one belt, one road network. So it will be divided. So I think Korea will be a good position to serve both markets because they are close to each other. But it's not easy to do that. I mean, that's the thing, If we serve China, then U.S. will give some penalties in the U.S. market, or vice versa. So maybe, even though we face a good opportunity, we'll be in a very sensitive and difficult position. Let me get back to the first issue raised by Young-Suk Lee. I mean, we have to think about final objective. some people criticize Trump for his own unilateral action, but the ultimate goal of U.S. policy on China is to correct the Chinese business practices and government practices, especially in the area of state-owned enterprises and subsidies. So if TikTok, whatever, the Chinese firms are receiving huge amount of government subsidy, and then combined with the more independent U.S. firms, they are combining together to have a joint venture. This is wrong signal to the rest of the world. So I think the precondition for business firms to do this kind of joint venture, we have to ask China whether you will continue to do state capitalism and putting a lot of government money in promoting certain high-tech areas. If they do that continuously, then I don't think we can do that. So our ultimate goal is to correct the Chinese government and business behaviors, not just simply discourage the Chinese firms. That's my response to you.
Okay, so let me pose another question. Yul Sohn mentioned about economic nationalism. Living in Silicon Valley, at Stanford, we see a lot of issue about tension over technology between U.S. and China. And as you know, Trump basically suspended H-1B visa. I know that about 2/3 are going to India, maybe like 15% going to China. And also there's attempt to limit Chinese engineers and scientists working in the Valley and in the United States. So, politically, it feels good, right? We are protecting, right, our workers. We are protecting our technology. We are protecting our patents. But who's going to fill in those the void, right? Now, frankly speaking, without Indian and Chinese engineers in the Silicon Valley, I don't think we can continue. That's why leaders of Google, Apple, they all oppose Trump administration's measure against immigration and so on. So if this continue, let's say we kick out a lot of foreign scientists and engineers, especially Chinese, right? Then is it going to hurt the United States as much as it hurts, maybe more than it hurts China?
Well, let me just, the issue of jobs, and if you look here on my building right before me, we're all about jobs. And I'd say that the challenge for the United States is we have more jobs than we have people. The COVID issue aside, where there's been significant reductions in employment. Yes, we do not have enough people to fill the number of engineering jobs that we need. And I think the challenge for the United States is to make sure that we, in our pursuit of strong security, we do not reduce our ability to innovate and continue to expand the economy. And that's a delicate balance. I certainly would argue that too much attention on the security issues probably is hurting the United States right now, and I'm not sure exactly what the alternative is. We're not producing engineers as fast as the demand would allow.
Okay, so maybe one final question, and then maybe we can go to audience for questions. And this is more for Professor Park, but also Charles can chime in as well. Because both of you were involved in trade negotiation with China and other countries. So, Korea, I think maybe Korea is the only country that has FTA with both US and China, right? Or maybe wrong. But anyway, so Korea has FTA with both of them, and they are fighting, right, over trade issue. So any implication, any impact on U.S. free trade with U.S. and China. I mean, already when Trump was in office, it pressured South Korea to modify. So, what's the implication, future implication for FTA for South Korea?
Well, if you look at the Korea-China FTA, I actually initiated, but I couldn't finish because we have a new government at the time. But Korea-China FTA is very low-level FTA, very loose, and it doesn't include investment and services sector. So it's really a partial agreement with the low kind of standard. So we cannot do anything much, with that so far, because we are in the middle of negotiating another chapter for services and investment. But as far as Chorus FTA is concerned, we had a revision last year, and it was okay, very minor revision. However, even though we have partner, very close FTA partners, U.S. gave us a sanction on our steel export to China, to United States, using Section 232. Usually in the past regime, if you are the FTA partners, you are excluded from that kind of penalties. But we are included. So FTA doesn't really matter when you talk about the securities, okay? And if you go back to Korea-China relations, we have the FTA, loose, but China give us a kind of informal sanction on Chinese tourists coming to Korea because of SARS. 2017, 8 million people comes in from China. 2018, 4 million people, 50% cut. We didn't do anything about this, even though we are the close trading partners. So if you talk about security in this relationship, FTA doesn't really matter. If we look at U.S., Canada, Mexico, USMCA, Mexico and Canada cannot say anything when they have a new agreement. So this is a real issue these days. It's very uncertain, very difficult issue, but we cannot do anything about. If they argue, this is because of security.
Charles, any comment?
Just for the record, the U.S. Chamber opposed Section 232 action by the administration. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think the use of security as an excuse to manage trade is a really unfortunate exercise. It's opening a Pandora's box of sins, and I hope that the administration does not resort to that effort again.
Okay, thank you so much for such a stimulating conversation. Now, let's go back to Dr. Sohn for addressing questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. One, I think that the questions are shown to you. One question is that it's about the next U.S. government. What do you think the prospects of U.S.-China decoupling under a possible Biden administration? Do you think that Biden administration's approach will be different from the current? Who will answer this difficult question?
I guess I can.
Yes,
I can.
Please, Charles.
Since I live in Washington, maybe I get the political question. The short answer is a Biden administration's approach to China probably would look very similar in strategy to that of the Trump administration, although fairly different in tactics. I think that there will be a continued focus on the threat that the perceived threat that China is to in the area of telecommunications and artificial intelligence and certain advanced technology. And so I don't see a significant reduction in decoupling efforts, even if the Trump administration's use of tariffs is reduced. I don't think that will be as significant an effort by the next administration.
Can I add a few things?
Please, please.
I agree with Charles. Biden, if he's elected, may have a similar kind of approach to give pressure to China on many things. But you said tactic, but his kind of approach might be different from Trump's administration. In other words, as far as Chinese issues like state capitalism or protecting intellectual property rights, that kind of issues, maybe Biden administration will do this kind of pressure with alliances with like-minded countries, especially EU. Really want to, they're very anxious to have a cooperation with the United States to correct this kind of improper behaviors of government like China. So I think the approach will be a little bit different rather than unilateral pressure, but Biden's administration will do more collectively, collective pressure to China. Thank you.
Well, just follow up to that question. There's a kind of left-wing section in the Democratic Party, particularly Sanders, whose view of trade is not so different from current administrations. And how do you think that play out when it comes to the issues of going back to TPP or creating more sort of liberal trade regime? Recreating international trade, for example.
I think politically these days politicians are using this kind of current situation to get support from labor group and other groups in their political purposes. But I know international trade, free trade will produce, I should not use the word losers, but those people who are affected, negatively affected from trade. So far, many governments not ignore, but didn't pay too much attention to this, kind of difficult sectors. So I think new governments, United States, may have to persuade those people using many different policies and still maintain the argument that free trade is better than nationalistic protectionism. I think that this is the kind of political phenomenon all over the places, which means that free trade is bad for laborers. No, that's not true. You are negatively affected, but the government can help you out. That kind of policy approach will be badly needed. So I want to suggest to the democratic government of the United States, don't give up the free trade, and market economy, but you have to provide more, inclusive kind of trade policy measures to help those people who are negatively affected.
Thank you. Any further comments? No. Then next question. I think this question is directed to Seungjoo. You mentioned that increasing regionalization of supply chains will proceed with China consolidating its top position. How do you place this trend in the context of current attempts by the United States to move supply chains out of China, such as EPN?
Microphone off.
Just a moment. Yeah, now mic is on.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And in my presentation, I try to stress that structural changes has been going on in East Asia for the last decade or two, in the sense of the global value chains or regional value chains have become highly regional in the sense that the hierarchical nature of supply chains have become very obvious and vivid. And I think in the short run, we may see the disruption in supply chains with the launch of the U.S. China tech competition. But in the long run, I think what we will see would be the dual dynamics. One would be the geographic scope of supply chains will broaden to include many other countries in East Asia. So actually, at this point of time, the hierarchical nature of the supply chains in East Asia is quite prevalent, but that kind of nature will further proceed and become more obvious on the one sense, and at the same time, the China would may be able to strengthen its endogenous capabilities in reorganizing the regional value chains as it successfully secure as a hub position in the regional supply chains. So that may deliver another kind of the dynamics in the reconfiguration of the supply chains in the region.
Thank you. Let me show you the next question. So it's this question, obviously, in the context of decoupling, economic decoupling. What are the prospects of China, Japan, South Korea regional trade networks? This trilateral FTA negotiations is undergoing, and then China is also proposing digital currency, things like that. So I think this question naturally goes to Minister Park first. And
okay, actually, I don't want to talk about the currency issue, but about trilateral FTA. When I served the government, I actually launched the trilateral FTA negotiation. However, the process so far is very slow, and even they are meeting sometimes, but no progress is made. In other words, if you look at the bilateral relations, even though we talk about trilateral FTA, if you look at the bilateral relations, some like Korea-Japan bilateral relations is not very good. In other words, even though they are participating in a trilateral format, if you have a bad bilateral relations, there's no progress to be made. And so, this is a very important economic integration when you talk about East Asian economic integration. However, trilateral, FTA is not moving forward. I think we have a security, but also political issues which are actually, banning the three countries from moving forward. So for the foreseeable near future, I don't think we will have a big progress on this issue.
Thank you. The next question is this. Professor Lee mentioned that JVs could be a solution to the U.S.-China trade dispute, but China is probably wary about their successful tech companies and being forced to divest and sell to U.S. companies. So do you think that China is likely to agree to such attempts?
So,
maybe,
yeah. Maybe I'll take a stab and some others can chime in. So I think the fact that Chinese investment is very global, and it's heavily in the United States as well. So, for instance, Tencent has invested in multiple companies that are critical in terms of operating because it has broad investment in the U.S. So I think that puts them in some constraint in that they can't just go on their own. And when these things are posed at this joint venture aspect, I think there is high probability that they will have to, in some part, agree and make concessions as well. And that's why I think this effort eventually where the U.S. and China will try to come up with technological solution either through joint ventures or collaborative efforts, initiatives will continue. And where that takes the two countries, I don't know, but I think it could be different paths. That's just my opinion.
Thank you. The next question is is there any potential alternative markets or partners that ROK government should shift toward in the midst of U.S.-China tension? I mean, we have already addressed things, but anybody wants to elaborate?
David, you're silent.
All right, I'll say something about. I mean, some of this stuff is total. Like, I don't know about JVs or anything like that, right? I was sort of smiling though because, in a sort of grim way, that of course we have Japan delisting Korea from the whitelist just a little over a year ago or so. And yet, what was interesting to me was how quickly or adroitly, from what I understand, is Korean companies were actually able to reroute a lot of their supply chains. I may be mistaken, but from what I understand is that this was actually a fairly self-defeating move by the Japanese, and that the Korean companies were actually able to find alternative markets. You know, and my fear for the United States in this is, while sure, we may put a gun to Huawei's head, I'm not, or, you know, these kinds of things of the visas and the F1 visas for students, I think are ultimately in the long term or even the short term very self-defeating for the United States. Yeah. Not that we should blindly be for free trade, but I think this rush to economic nationalism and frankly military nationalism on the U.S. part for a China threat, I think is overblown, and I think we're harming ourselves. So when I think of what Korea might be able to do, I think there's alternatives. You know, I remember in the 80s we had these debates about Japan cutting off supplies to the United States would be in trouble. And a lot of economists said there's always alternatives. So I don't know exactly where the Korean companies are going to go, but I really think that the more that we start to try and build barriers, the worse off we make America. In general, I think that's the case. And I would go along with the minister saying, we don't want to say losers, but the people who are negatively impacted, that's the task for domestic governments to help. Right. So I'll stop.
Thank you. I saw Minister Park. You want to reply?
I'll just add one thing. The previous question, talk about where the Korean government should shift toward. I think business firms are doing their own jobs, but I think government, as far as current government is concerned, they're emphasizing more closer relationship with ASEAN countries, Southeast Asia. In other words, Vietnam, Indonesia, Myanmar, that kind of countries. And also at the same time, the current government established a special committee on so-called our cooperation with the northern part of the Asia. In other words, Central Asian countries, including Uzbekistan, that kind of. So I don't know whether our companies are following the direction of the government, but as far as I know, Korean government want to diversify its trade relations or economic relations into those kind of developing countries.
Can I just maybe I can just quickly chime in?
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the challenges with ASEAN and it's an obvious alternative in terms of a supply hub or at least a place that one can move a significant percentage of supply. The capacity to absorb supply chain movement from China into ASEAN is very limited. And I think even Vietnam, which was and certainly has received a lot of investment from Samsung and from other Korean firms, that's really kind of tapping out. It doesn't have the labor that's required. It doesn't have the power. It doesn't have the land. So it's doesn't have the infrastructure. So and that's true all across ASEAN. The problem with China is that it's so big and so effective at doing what it does. It's really impossible to replace. You know, we had I think about 18 months ago Commerce Secretary, U.S. Commerce Secretary Ross visited the African country of Ghana and was making a big deal about how Ghana was an alternative, interesting alternative market. If you look at the size of Ghana's economy, the province of Zhejiang grew larger in 1 year than the entire economy of Ghana. So, it's really quite hard to replace China. It's just so big and so effective.
I agree with Charles. Main idea of Korean firms moving into Vietnam or Indonesia is wages. Very low skill labors, but very cheap labors compared to Chinese labors. So it's not, seriously nothing to do with the decoupling. But already that kind of trend is happening because Vietnam per capita wages are 1/3 of the Chinese per capita wages. That's why Korean firms are investing. But the Vietnamese government officials are really concerned about their capability of having technology advancement, training their laborers because they are so low stages yet.
Thank you, Professor Kyuk-shin. Do you? We'll have to conclude now. Do you have any remarks? No.
Thank you so much. Arranging this webinar, and then thanks to all of you for participation. And I think it's a great discussion, great start. Maybe we can revisit in a few months, and maybe after election is over. Mm-hmm. But thank you so much.
I think so too. I really hope that APARC and the EAI continue to endeavor together on this very important issue. And I also think that this is a very interesting, very stimulating discussion. So it's been great to be with you all, and also the audience. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.